intellectual media videos, I've discussed the factors that make Black people a disproportionate part of America's poor. In this video, I want to explore the theme of Black excellence being conflated with Black elitism, wealth, and classism. I also want to address how the Black upper class has historically helped or hindered Black progress, and white supremacy. To start this conversation, we have to go back. The class dichotomy in the Black community of the haves and the have-nots, the brokies and the bag securers, has roots in slavery. The first division were the free Blacks and the slaves. Then among the slaves there were outside slaves and house slaves, a caste system that came with privileges for the latter group. These privileges were usually in the form of better food and less physical labor, better clothing, and better access to education, as some slave owners believed smarter house slaves meant a more efficient house. Being in the house also meant more frequent interactions with whites, which often included sexual harassment and assault. But it also meant something else. The rape of Black women begat light-skinned children with superiority complexes, and even resulted in inheritances of money or land. Along with some freed Blacks who had managed to work for wages before emancipation and save up for their coins, the children of rape and the privileges they received were the initial seeds of wealth in the Black community after emancipation. The emergence of what would come to be known as HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities in the 1860s, created a stepping stone and status symbol for those few Blacks who could afford to attend. Because of their money and often their proximity to whiteness, they were able to begin careers in medicine, dentistry, and law. They would start funeral homes, banks, insurance companies, and newspapers. All of these professions were highly necessary, especially because of the rigid segregation of the era. And these doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs would become the upper Black class. They moved close to progressive cities and Black universities, away from most of the poor Negroes in rural Southern enclaves. These newly moneyed Blacks made their homes in Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philly, Tuskegee, and later Atlanta. They attended Black Episcopal or Congregational churches, where the vibes were formal, with well-educated clergy and small and exclusive membership lists. They donated funds to various philanthropic efforts and supported civil rights efforts through organizations like the NAACP. But for a long time, they also kept their vast wealth and minimal political power concentrated amongst themselves. They established still surviving societies and social clubs that many Blacks today still haven't heard of, let alone know how to join, like Boulé, Lynx, and Jack and Jill. Boulé is an all-male society that greatly influences Black politics, and most of its members are historically wealthy and well-connected. Jack and Jill is a children's society founded in 1938 by a small group of upper-class Black women who wanted to create a playgroup where their kids could mingle with the right kind of people. Through this highly privileged program, children are introduced to educational, social, and cultural experiences the average Black child from the hood could only dream of. They get early exposure to professional careers and are provided a network of friends and opportunities that help them get extra help to the top. These kids and teens nurtured lifelong bonds, and throughout the 20th century, it was common for them to find their marriage partners at monthly Jack and Jill meetings, limiting the possibility of inter-class dating, or more bluntly, dating down. Because Jack and Jill has historically extended memberships by invitation only, with no application fees, and you get in by knowing someone who already belongs, those with wealth, professional circles, and private school credentials make up the bulk of the membership. But to be clear, it was reported that membership grew in the 70s and 80s as more Black Americans moved into the suburbs than ever before. And the organization changed its mission to, quote, reflect the isolation felt by many Blacks living in predominantly white suburbs. Instead of helping Blacks assimilate into white culture, the organization is seeking to instill a sense of ethnic pride in suburban Black children. But this still left out a large chunk of Black children who would have benefited. This kind of class-based privilege was probably what W.E.B. Du Bois had in mind when he first began promoting the talented 10th. But before addressing him, let's run it back to Booker T. Washington, who adamantly promoted industrial education and the concept of the Black community, focusing on economic progress and betterment rather than acquiring political and civil rights. The only way to do this was, of course, by sacrificing Black lives to white supremacy, as Washington lived during the nadir of American race relations, when anti-Black violence was especially harsh and frequent. While most inaugural members of the black upper class began purchasing nice clothes, cars, and homes to fit in with a white America rapidly becoming obsessed with consumerism, mass lynchings, voter suppression, and discrimination raged across the country for the average black person. But that's not to say the black upper class didn't face their own discrimination, nor were they not doing anything for progress. In addition to charitable donations, in their view, by showcasing the elite black community and demonstrating their wealth and pedigree, they weren't only proving their humanity to white people, but lifting up the lower black classes as shining examples for how to attain wealth and behave. The whole thing reeked of classist respectability politics, insinuating that poor blacks were stuck in their positions because of behavior, not systemic race and class issues. This ideology, known as the talented 10th, was crafted by white liberal philanthropists who wanted to train a class of black elites to support white liberal interests and teach other blacks. W.E.B. Du Bois publicized the term the talented 10th as a leadership class of 1 in 10 black men who could best serve the community by getting classical educations and attaining wealth. Black children of the upper class, as described by Lawrence Otis Graham in his book Our Kind of People and Margot Jefferson in her book Negroland, were encouraged to think of themselves as elite members of their race who were to serve as examples for the rest of the community. At black college campuses like Howard, students were subjected to the elitist status quo. Howard was founded in 1867 but didn't see its first black president until 1926, and he was extremely light-skinned. Colorism thrived in all corners of the black upper class, with members encouraged to lighten skin, press unruly hair, and even obtain facial surgery in the later half of the 20th century when operations were more accessible. At Howard in 1928, a frustrated student wrote about the colorism in the school's Greek community, saying, "We are not so surprised when we hear such rumors and reports about institutions of learning owned, controlled, and attended by white people, but it certainly comes as a great shock and causes a feeling of shame when we hear such news about Negro colleges. At first glance, it would seem incredible that Negroes, themselves the victims of ignorant prejudice and discrimination because of color, should follow the lead of the Nordics." Howard itself was apolitical for the first half of its existence, as it wanted to be seen as a black Harvard or Yale. Initially, students were concerned with being respectable members of the upper class, but by the late 60s, more students had become aligned with the civil rights and black power movements. Elitism and classism could still be found lurking in the fraternities and sororities, however, as belonging to these exclusive organizations meant not only being able to afford college, but membership dues as well. Hopefully you've noticed that a recurring theme in the creation and sustaining of the black upper class is access to resources, most predominantly education. While many members of the black upper class, who make up most black Republicans, will champion personal responsibility and bootstrap narratives as the keys to lifting unfortunate Negroes out of poverty, this clashes directly with their history. It started with black people who were freed from bondage early and allowed to work while others toiled away in slavery. It continued with those blacks who were gifted money, land, or education, while the rest were locked in subservience or living under the worst conditions of Jim Crow. Since the beginning of the 20th century, these upper-class blacks were not always self-reliant, as they had networks of wealthy family members and friends, access to the right clubs and opportunities, and money and time for enrollment at good grade schools and colleges. They had resources, they had each other, and more than that, they had a lower class of blacks who contributed to their wealth. Madam C.J. Walker, the first quote-unquote self-made black millionaire, sold her hair products to black people. When she was building her 20,000 square foot house in Irvington, New York in 1917, a white woman remarked to New York Times, "Impossible. No woman of her race could afford such a place." The various black men who amassed fortune by selling life insurance policies did so through the wallets of black clients. I could list out every entrepreneur and how they made their money similarly through black customers, but instead I'll drive home the point. Just like today, there was no room for everybody to be black beauty suppliers or black insurers or black newspaper owners. This is why I really hate it when certain people act like everyone in the black community is one eyelash or t-shirt company away from being a millionaire. For capitalism to remain super lucrative for the few, they must concentrate ownership and resources among themselves. Otherwise, they'd have nobody to sell to, nobody to serve, nobody to profit from. So ultimately, there's always a group of impoverished people being bombarded with both consumerist fantasies of status symbols like fancy cars and clothes, and accusations of laziness, lack of determination, and government mooching. Speaking of alleged government mooching, since at least the late 70s, many members of the black upper class have advocated politically against welfare and government aid in a few ways, and there are definitely reasons to be concerned about the black elite's impact on the rest of us. Nowadays, the black elite includes more than just old moneyed families and professionals. It includes celebs, athletes, and politicians, three occupations that black people have only seen wide success in the past few decades. These are some of the same people who don't feel the full burden of racial oppression because they're not only wealthy, but also have greater access to resources and people with power. The classist attitudes they have about poor blacks carries over into their politics, their devastatingly influential public personas, and their personal actions. Of course, you've got the obvious black Republicans who buy into myths about welfare queens and lazy hoodlums squandering opportunities for fun vacations to prison, but then they're aided by centrist voices like the now disgraced Bill Cosby, who in between rapes spent years pouring money into HBCUs and scholarships, but at the same time was berating poor blacks for wearing baggy pants or being ghetto as if those were the reasons for their circumstances, even going so far as to suggest that racism was used as a crutch for poverty. It was classist and elitist blacks like Cosby who endorsed ordinances that would ban baggy pants in the 2000s and who went along with racist dog whistles about thugs when Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, and others lost their lives in the years to come. Classist respectability politics do more than just concentrate wealth and power or lead to black people being shot in the streets by cops who never face punishments. Respectability politics approves state-sanctioned violence against black people in prison. As adherents love to point out, if you don't want to go to prison, don't commit a crime. Like this country doesn't systematically ensnare people of color into the mass industrial complex through poverty and neglect. Congressman Charles Rangel, a Democrat, was a supporter in Nixon's White House of revving up the war on drugs. He founded the nonpartisan but still mostly Democrat Congressional Black Caucus, which voted to defund rehabilitation centers, fund more prisons, and agreed with harsh legislation for drug offenders. This wasn't the first or last time a Democratic black member of the upper class would ignore class and race realities to make judgment calls on the poor black community. In 2008, Obama made a speech about absentee black fathers and its connection to black progress, a typical talking point from people looking down on ghetto blacks that neglects mass incarceration and the less than stellar track record of white parents. And then, along with all of the black politicians reeking of classism, you've got it permeating hip-hop and black culture. If you listen to the music, watch the interviews, and check out the type of viral content that gets black Twitter riled up, you see it's all loaded with insults about broke niggas, flexing on others, and giving up certain vacation spots or designer labels when too many Negroes start acquiring it. To be clear, the classism that exists in hip-hop and black culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. America is classist at its very roots. Something we're reminded when we think about this country's ultra-defining constitution being penned by wealthy male landowners and slave owners, the only people allowed to do something so important. We're a society obsessed with acquisition, acquiring power, acquiring real estate, acquiring wealth. And boy, is that third one crucial for the other two. Don't believe me? It takes damn near $10 million to run for Congress and nearly $1 billion to run for president. In the midst of all of this acquiring, there is a sacrificial class of blacks left to bear the consequences. Like those scores of black people murdered during the nadir of American race relations while Booker T. Washington advocated for the continuance of white social and political dominance, black victims of classism are real casualties. While blacks will continue climbing their way to the top, stepping on the backs of others and claiming to be self-reliant like the wealthy white descendants of slave owners, they might want to remember that arriving doesn't guarantee security. They're still just Negroes in a white supremacist world. Want to see more great long format videos like this? Well, you can, over on Patreon, where a $1 to $3 monthly pledge grants you access to exclusive videos and essays. Plus, your pledge produces more great free content like this. Check the link in the description box below for more information. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe.